Routine had always been my sanctuary. Waking up at 6, brewing my coffee just the way I liked it, heading to work, and coming home to the comfort of our living room, where Emma and I would unwind with a new episode of whatever series had caught our attention that season. I had always prided myself on the stability of our life together. Predictability was something I had come to cherish, not as a sign of boredom, but as proof of the life we had built, solid, unshakable. Then, one evening, that illusion cracked. It was a small thing, something most people wouldn't even think twice about. I had come home later than usual after a particularly grueling day at work. My boss had thrown an impromptu meeting at the end of the day, and traffic on the way back had been relentless. When I finally stepped through the front door, the house was dimly lit, carrying the soft hum of our television. Emma was curled up on the couch, a blanket draped over her legs, eyes fixed on the screen. I smiled, feeling the exhaustion momentarily lift as I walked toward her. Then I saw it, the credits rolling, the unmistakable theme song of our favorite show filling the room. The same show we had vowed to watch together, episode by episode. The final episode of the season. The one we had promised we'd wait to watch as a couple. Felt like a slap in the face. She turned to me, eyes widening slightly, but only for a moment. A weak smile followed, the kind people give when they're caught doing something they shouldn't be doing but are trying to downplay it. She laughed it off, telling me she couldn't resist. Said she'd rewatch it with me. But something didn't sit right. Emma wasn't careless. She was sentimental about little things, about traditions. She wouldn't just break that promise unless there was a reason. And the way she shifted, the way she avoided looking directly at me as she got up to grab something from the kitchen, it wasn't guilt over watching an episode without me. It was something else. Something deeper. I didn't press the issue then. I told myself I was overreacting. That it was just a show, just an episode. That I was tired, and maybe my mind was trying to create problems where none existed. But doubts are like cracks in glass. Once they start, they only grow. The next few days I started noticing more things. Subtle things. She had started locking her phone more often, leaving it face down on the table when she never used to. She had been dressing differently, just slightly, nothing too drastic, but enough to make me wonder. She had taken more calls in the other room, laughing in hushed tones before quickly hanging up whenever I walked in. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. I needed to know. I found myself replaying the moment over and over again, analyzing her expression, her body language, every small thing that felt off in that moment. My mind told me I was overreacting, but my gut refused to listen. And so I started paying attention. I had always trusted Emma completely, never once feeling the need to invade her privacy. But trust isn't blind, and when cracks start forming, it's impossible not to look through them. One evening, while she was in the shower, I saw her phone lying unattended on the nightstand. I had never felt the urge to check before, but now, the temptation was too strong. Her phone was locked, a 6-digit code where there hadn't been one before. That alone told me something had changed. I placed it back carefully, making sure it was exactly as I had found it. I didn't want her to know I had noticed. I needed more information. If I confronted her now, she would have an easy way out. Deny it. Make me feel like I was being paranoid. No, I had to wait. That weekend, we had dinner plans with our friends, Mark and Sophie. A double date we had been planning for weeks. Emma was unusually quiet that evening, barely engaging in conversation. Sophie asked her if she was feeling all right, and Emma quickly plastered on a smile, saying she was just tired from work. I nodded along, pretending to believe it. I watched her throughout the night, the way she kept checking her phone under the table, her thumb tapping away quickly before she placed it back in her lap. It was subtle, but I noticed. When we got home, I casually mentioned that she had seemed distracted at dinner. She brushed it off, saying she had a stressful day at work. The same excuse she had been using more and more lately. I nodded, pretending to accept her answer. But in my mind, the pieces were slowly coming together. The next day, I decided to test something. I left for work at my usual time but circled back around the block, parking down the street where she wouldn't see me. I sat there, waiting, heart pounding, wondering if I was losing my mind. Then, 15 minutes later, I saw it. A car pulling up in front of the house. A man stepping out, walking up to the door. Emma opening it without hesitation, letting him in. I sat there, frozen, watching as the door shut behind them. It wasn't just a show she had watched without me. It was something much worse. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind raced, my breath shallow. The sight of that unknown man entering my home, being welcomed in by Emma as if it were the most natural thing in the world, had shattered whatever fragile hope I had left that I was simply overthinking. There was no denying it now. Something was very, very wrong. Still, I didn't move. My body refused to act, paralyzed by the sickening confirmation of my suspicions. My stomach twisted into knots, my heart hammering against my ribs. I knew that if I stormed inside at that very moment, I would act on pure emotion. And I couldn't afford that. Not yet. I needed to be sure. I forced myself to breathe, to think. I needed proof. Not just for myself, but for whatever came next. A confrontation with only accusations would give her room to deny everything, to twist reality in her favor. No, I needed something concrete, undeniable. Something that would leave her with no way out. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone. I opened the camera, zooming in on the house. The front door remained closed, curtains drawn. The world outside carried on as usual. Neighbors walked their dogs. A delivery truck passed by. But inside my home, my wife was with another man. I snapped a few photos of his car, the license plate, the time. It was a start, but it wasn't enough. I needed more. For the next 2 hours, I waited. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to act, but I forced myself to stay put, my mind running through every possibility. Maybe he was just a coworker, a friend. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe. Then the door opened. I quickly lowered myself in the seat, heart pounding. Emma stepped out first, adjusting her dress, running a hand through her hair. A moment later, the man followed. They exchanged a few quiet words before she smiled. A smile that wasn't meant for me. A smile that had once been mine. He reached out, brushing her arm, and she didn't pull away. My grip on the phone tightened as I took another series of photos. Proof. Undeniable proof. As the man got into his car and drove off, Emma lingered at the door, watching until his car disappeared down the street. Only then did she go back inside, completely unaware that I had witnessed everything. I sat there, my mind in chaos. Anger, betrayal, heartbreak. It all mixed together into something toxic, something that threatened to consume me. But I forced myself to focus. This wasn't over. Not yet. The next step was clear. I needed to know who he was. I uploaded the photos to my laptop that evening, running the license plate through an online search. Took some time, but eventually I had a name, a face, a social media profile. Nathan Carter, coworker, married. The revelation sent a fresh wave of disgust through me. It wasn't just an affair. It was a double betrayal. He had a wife just like I did. Family. And yet, here he was, sneaking around with mine. I scrolled through his profile, piecing together what I could. Photos of him with his wife, his job at Emma's firm. Comments from mutual friends, all oblivious to what was happening behind closed doors. I had enough proof now to confront her, to destroy everything she had built on lies. But as I sat there, staring at the evidence, a new thought crept into my mind. Revenge. I could confront her, scream, demand answers. But what would that accomplish? She would cry, deny, maybe even try to twist it back onto me. But what if I took control instead? What if I made her suffer the way she had made me suffer? A plan began to form. Over the next few days, I gathered more evidence. I combed through her phone while she slept, finding hidden messages, deleted conversations. They had been meeting for months. The betrayal ran deeper than I had imagined. But I didn't let on that. I knew. I played my role perfectly, loving husband, unsuspecting fool. I kissed her goodbye in the mornings, told her I loved her, all while knowing the truth. And she had no idea. The first stage of my plan was simple. I needed to make her believe everything was fine. So I suggested something we hadn't done in a while. A date night. Her eyes lit up at the idea, as if she truly believed nothing had changed. Little did she know it was the beginning of the end. When the night arrived, I took her to our favorite restaurant, the place where we had celebrated anniversaries, birthdays. I smiled across the table, watching her, knowing that this would be the last time she would ever look at me without fear. Halfway through dinner, I excused myself to the restroom, but instead, I stepped outside, pulling out my phone. I had already contacted Nathan's wife earlier that day, sending her every piece of evidence I had gathered. Now, I sent her one final message. He's with her right now. You deserve to see for yourself. And then I waited. 15 minutes later, the restaurant doors burst open. Nathan's wife stood there, rage and heartbreak battling for control on her face. She spotted Emma immediately, her eyes locking onto her with a fire that could burn the entire world down. And in that moment I knew I had won. Emma turned to me, confusion turning into realization, her face draining of color as the pieces clicked into place. She had no idea what was coming next. And this was only the beginning. The restaurant fell silent for a brief moment, the air thick with tension. All eyes turned toward the scene unfolding at the entrance, where Nathan's wife stood frozen, staring directly at Emma. The weight of her presence alone sent a ripple of unease through the room. Conversations halted, forks clattered against plates, and then, just as suddenly, the silence shattered. Nathan's wife stormed toward our table, her hands clenched into fists, her breaths shallow and ragged. Emma, oblivious to the impending catastrophe, smiled at her politely, still unaware of who she was. But then her eyes flickered toward me, searching for an explanation. And in that moment, I saw it, the slow realization creeping across her face, the pieces clicking into place. Emma's face paled. Her hands, which had been resting lightly on the table, curled inward, gripping the edge of her napkin as if it could anchor her to something solid. Nathan's wife reached our table, her voice quivering with barely restrained fury as she spat his name. When Emma flinched, the last vestige of doubt evaporated from my mind. Nathan was a ghost in that moment, his absence more damning than his presence could ever be. But his wife, she was fire incarnate. She leaned in close to Emma, her words a sharp blade that cut through the tension. Emma's lips parted, but no words came out. She glanced at me again, eyes wide, pleading, but I simply leaned back in my chair and folded my arms. This was exactly where I wanted her. The confrontation escalated quickly. Nathan's wife wasn't here for a quiet discussion. She was here for destruction. Her voice rose, accusations pouring out like venom, each word laced with years of love betrayed. She detailed the text messages, the secret meetings, the undeniable proof of what Emma and Nathan had been doing behind our backs. Emma tried to speak, to explain, but she was drowning in the tidal wave of truth. Every excuse, every denial she could have conjured up was ripped away before she even had the chance to utter it. The people at the surrounding tables were watching now, some pretending not to listen, others leaning in, their expressions a mix of shock and curiosity. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, the restaurant doors opened again. Nathan walked in. I watched his expression shift from confusion to horror as his gaze swept across the room, landing first on his wife, then on Emma, then finally on me. He must have thought he had everything under control, that his life would continue uninterrupted. But here, in front of everyone, his two worlds collided with a force that left him breathless. Nathan's wife turned, her fury now fully redirected. She advanced on him, her voice rising another octave, demanding answers, demanding explanations. He stammered, looking toward Emma, looking toward me, searching for some way out. There was no way out. I stayed silent, watching, letting it all unfold. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the one where Emma finally saw the full consequences of her actions, where the weight of her betrayal came crashing down on her shoulders. She had lied. She had deceived me, and now she had to live with it. The restaurant manager intervened before things could turn truly ugly. Security was called, and soon Nathan and his wife were being escorted outside. Emma sat there, shaking, her face void of color. I could see her trying to piece together what had just happened, trying to calculate how to salvage what was left. But there was nothing left. I stood, dropping some cash on the table for the meal I no longer had any interest in finishing. Emma's eyes snapped to mine, her lips trembling as she whispered my name. I ignored her. I turned and walked out, leaving her sitting there, abandoned in the wreckage of her choices. That night, I didn't go home. I stayed at a hotel, needing space, needing distance. My phone buzzed endlessly. Messages from Emma, desperate attempts to explain, to plead for forgiveness. I didn't read them. I didn't respond. The next morning, I returned to the house. Emma was there, sitting on the couch, her eyes red and swollen. She looked up when I entered, but I held up a hand, cutting her off before she could speak. I told her I knew everything, that I had known for a while, that there was no coming back from this. She begged. She cried. She said she had made a mistake, that she never meant to hurt me, that she still loved me. I told her I didn't care. Over the next few days, I made arrangements. A lawyer was hired. Papers were drawn up. Emma, perhaps knowing she had no other option, didn't fight me on it. The house would be mine. She would leave. And just like that, it was over. But something still didn't sit right with me. It wasn't enough that she lost me. She needed to feel the same level of betrayal, the same level of devastation that she had inflicted upon me. And so, I made one final move before letting her go for good. I sent every piece of evidence I had gathered to her family. Her parents, her siblings, the people who had always seen her as the devoted wife, the perfect partner. I let them see the truth, let them witness what she had done. The fallout was immediate. Her father called me first furious. Not at me, but at her. Her mother left me a tearful voicemail, apologizing for what their daughter had done. And Emma? She called once, twice, 3 times, before finally sending a single message. How could you do this to me? I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. You did this to yourself. And with that, I blocked her number, deleted our photos, and erased her from my life completely. For the first time in months, I finally felt free. Emma's world crumbled just as swiftly as she had shattered mine. In the days following our last conversation, I kept my distance, watching from the shadows as her carefully constructed reality collapsed around her. She had thought she was untouchable, that her betrayal could be contained within the walls of secrecy she had built. But the truth had a way of seeping through even the strongest barriers, and now she was drowning in it. Her parents were the first to confront her. After receiving the evidence I had sent them, they wasted no time in expressing their disappointment. Her father, a man who had always held Emma on a pedestal, refused to take her calls. Her mother, once warm and compassionate, now saw her daughter through a different lens, one of shame and disbelief. I heard through mutual friends that Emma had packed a bag and left their house in tears, realizing that the support system she had always relied on had crumbled beneath her feet. At work, things were no better. Nathan's wife, emboldened by the truth, had taken her own steps to make sure Nathan faced consequences for his actions. She filed for divorce immediately, exposing the affair in a way that ensured their colleagues would know exactly what kind of man he was. His reputation, once untarnished, was now forever stained by scandal. And Emma, being part of the equation, found herself entangled in the fallout. Rumors spread like wildfire, and soon she became the subject of whispered conversations in the break room, of lingering stares filled with judgment and quiet condemnation. Nathan resigned within the week, unable to withstand the professional shame. Emma, however, stayed, perhaps out of stubbornness, or perhaps because she had nowhere else to go. But the walls were closing in on her, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she broke completely. I had thought that watching her suffer would bring me satisfaction, that seeing her stripped of the things she had taken for granted would feel like justice. But as the days stretched into weeks, a strange emptiness settled in my chest. Revenge had been my guiding force, the thing that kept me moving forward when all I wanted to do was collapse under the weight of my heartbreak. And now that it had run its course, I was left standing in the wreckage, wondering if I had won or simply lost in a different way. One evening, as I sat in my near-empty home, the home we had once shared, I received an email from Emma. I stared at the subject line for a long time before finally opening it. I don't know what to say. The message was short, apologetic but not desperate. She admitted that she had made the worst mistake of her life, that she had let something selfish and fleeting destroy everything good we had built. She wrote about how she had been blind to the depth of what she had done, how she had never truly considered the pain she would inflict. And now that she had lost everything, her marriage, her family's trust, her dignity, she finally understood. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't ask for another chance. She simply wanted me to know that she carried the weight of her actions, that she would never escape the consequences of her choices. And for the first time since it all began, I believed her. I didn't respond. Instead, I closed my laptop and stepped outside, inhaling the crisp night air. The stars stretched endlessly above me, indifferent to the chaos of human lives. And as I stood there, feeling the cool wind against my skin, I realized something important. I had spent so much time focused on the destruction of Emma's life that I had forgotten to rebuild my own. The next morning, I made a decision. I gathered the last of Emma's belongings, the things she hadn't yet come to retrieve, and dropped them off at a storage facility. I called my lawyer and finalized the last details of the divorce. And then, for the first time in months, I looked toward the future instead of the past. I took time off work and traveled, a solo trip, something I had never done before. I visited places Emma and I had once dreamed of going, but this time, they were mine alone to explore. I reconnected with old friends, strengthening bonds that had frayed over the years. And slowly, piece by piece, I started to find myself again. Emma, too, faded into the background. Occasionally, I would hear snippets of her life through mutual acquaintances. She had moved to a small apartment on the other side of town, living alone. She kept to herself, avoided social gatherings, and rarely spoke about what had happened. It seemed that she was truly trying to rebuild, just as I was. Perhaps in another life things could have been different. Perhaps we could have found a way to heal. But this was the life we had now, shaped by choices that could never be undone. And as I stood at the edge of a new beginning, I finally let go of the last remnants of the past. I was free. Time moved forward, indifferent to everything that had unraveled. The weeks turned to months, and with each passing day, the weight of what had happened began to loosen its grip on me. There were still echoes of the past, of course, triggers that sent my mind spiraling back into the pain. Moments where I would wake up expecting to hear Emma's soft breathing beside me only to be greeted by the stillness of an empty bed. But I had learned to live with it, to accept that healing was not about erasing the scars but learning how to carry them. One day, while sorting through some old boxes in my attic, I stumbled upon a forgotten collection of photographs. There we were, Emma and I, frozen in moments that once felt eternal. Smiling at a beachside sunset, laughing over a shared joke at a family gathering, sitting close on the couch, wrapped in the warmth of a life that had once been enough. I traced my fingers over one particular picture, taken in the early days of our relationship. We looked so young, so unburdened. And yet, the people in that photo no longer existed. We had become strangers long before the final betrayal. I set the photos aside, realizing that I no longer needed to hold on to them. The past had its place, but it did not belong in my future. With that in mind, I packed them away, sealing the box and placing it at the very back of the attic. I didn't need to burn them or throw them away. Just knowing they were there out of sight was enough. That same evening, I received an unexpected message. It was from Emma. She asked if we could meet for coffee. Just once. No expectations, no hidden motives, just closure. I stared at the message for a long time. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend she no longer existed in my world. But another part of me, the part that had loved her once, knew that meeting her wasn't about giving her what she wanted. It was about giving myself permission to finally let go. I agreed. The cafe we chose was small and unassuming, a neutral ground where neither of us had any shared history. I arrived early, ordering my coffee and choosing a quiet table near the window. When Emma walked in, I barely recognized her. She looked different, not in a dramatic way, but in the way people do when life has stripped them down to their most vulnerable form. She sat across from me, offering a small, hesitant smile. For a few moments, neither of us spoke, the silence filled with 1,000 unsaid words. Finally, she took a deep breath and spoke first. She told me about her life since the divorce, how she had spent months trying to understand herself, to figure out where she had gone wrong. She admitted that she had lost more than just me. She had lost herself, her family's trust, her own sense of stability. She had tried to outrun the consequences of her actions, but in the end, they had caught up with her. I listened, letting her speak, but I felt no anger, no sadness, just an odd sort of detachment, as if I were hearing the story of a stranger. When she finished, she looked at me expectantly, as if waiting for some kind of reaction. But there was nothing left to give. I had already processed it all, lived through the pain, and emerged on the other side. I didn't need an apology, and I didn't need to forgive her for her sake. I had already done that for myself. So I told her the truth, that I wished her well, that I hoped she found peace, but that our chapter had closed, and there was no rewriting it. She nodded, accepting my words, though I could see the regret in her eyes. We finished our coffee in silence, and when we left the cafe, we walked in opposite directions without looking back. That was the last time I saw Emma. Life carried on. I found myself moving forward in ways I never expected. I traveled more, spent time with people who truly valued me, and slowly, a new sense of happiness began to take root. It wasn't the kind of happiness that came from another person. It was something I had built for myself. And then, one day, I met someone new. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, and it didn't need to be. It was slow, steady, built on honesty and trust. And for the first time in a long time, I felt safe. Looking back, I realized that Emma's betrayal had been the end of one life, but not the end of my life. It had forced me to break apart, but in doing so, I had been able to rebuild into something stronger, something better. I had survived. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.